Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick, this is Swiftful Thinking, and in the last video we successfully downloaded the images for all of our coins in our app. And it's great, it's working. But if you followed the SwiftUI Continue Learning playlist before this, you probably immediately realized that although we're downloading all those coin images, we are not saving them anywhere. So what that means is every time that coin comes back on the screen, we're going to re-download all of that data. And of course, in our apps, if we already have the data downloaded, it is much better, much more efficient to just save and reuse that data rather than downloading it yet again from the internet. So in this video, we're going to create yet another utility class, but this one is going to deal with the file manager and give us the ability to save images to the file manager and also get images from the file manager. So I covered this again in the last playlist. You guys are probably familiar with this, but now we get to actually see how it can become so important in a real application. Because in this application specifically, every time you open the app, you are more or less going to probably see the same images, right? Like Bitcoin is the number one, and it's probably going to pop up every time we load our data. So it'd be much more efficient to save the image for Bitcoin rather than downloading it every single time we open our application. All right, welcome back everyone. I'm back in our Xcode project, of course. And I'm going to click resume on the canvas here, and in the last video we actually set up some logic to download these images, and we can now see on all of our rows we have the logo for each of these images. And that should be looking pretty cool. I mean, our app is really starting to come together. And what we're going to work on now is, although we are downloading these images, we are not saving them in our app. So every time we reopen the app, we're going to download this image again. And every time I scroll away and then scroll back to it, it's going to download that image again. And what would be even more efficient is to actually just save this either in the local memory or in the file manager. And this way, if we already downloaded it, we don't have to download it again a second time. So just to prove that quickly, let's jump into where we have our code to download that image. Let's go into the coin image service. We made this in the last video, and when we call getCoinImage, it is getting the URL for the coin and then downloading it here in the network manager. So when we go into this function, let's just print out here, downloading image now. All right, so let's run the app on a simulator quickly. And when these images start to get downloaded, we should get these printouts to the console, just so you guys can see exactly when they are downloading. All right, so as soon as my app loads here, I get a bunch of printouts to the console. And it looks like we called download image maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, about 12 times. And that's representative of the 12 images that we see on the screen right here. And let me make this a little bit bigger. And as I start to scroll down my list, we'll see a bunch more calls being made to download these images because we're downloading each one as they come onto the screen. And that's perfect. We don't want to download it before it's on the screen. We only want to download the stuff that's on the screen. But what's not efficient now is, so I'm going to press enter down here just to leave a little bit of space. And as I start to scroll up on this list, all of the coins above this we already saw. So they should have already been downloaded. But we didn't save it anywhere. So when we go back to those coins and I start scrolling up, we're going to see all these downloading images getting called again. So what this really means is all of these images that we're now seeing a second time, we're actually downloading them a second time as well. So that of course is not efficient. And it's working obviously, but it's not efficient. And we want to be efficient developers here. And when you are developing your apps, you don't want to be downloading excess data. If we can reuse some data that we already downloaded, it's much better. So what we're going to do is actually save these images to the file manager on the device. So this way, if we close the app, we restart the app, and we come back in, all these images that we already downloaded will be saved. And I'm using the file manager instead of a cache because every time I reopen this app, it's basically going to load these exact same coins, because more or less the top coins and the coins that we're going to see on this app are going to be relatively the same. And that's why I'm going to put them into the file manager instead of a catch. If these coins were going to be different every single time, I would probably use a catch and not actually save it to the device. But anyway, let's go back into our Xcode here. We're going to start by making a file for our file manager. So I'm going to right click in the utilities folder here and create a new file. Let's create a Swift file and let's call this local file manager. Go ahead and click create. And in here, we're going to create a class called local file manager and then open the brackets. And I'm calling this local file manager just because sometimes Xcode get confused if we use just the word file manager, because there actually is obviously a file manager keyword as itself. So just to be explicit, I'm just added this local word in the front of it. And this is going to be a singleton instance. So we're going to write static let instance. We're going to set it equal to local file manager. Again, this is going to be the one instance that we're going to use for this manager for our entire app. So this is the only time we are going to initialize this manager. And because it's inside this class, we can then go ahead and make sure that the initializer is private to this class. So we'll add a private init, open close parentheses, open the brackets. We're actually not going to do anything in this init, so we can just close up the brackets like that. All right, and there's two main functions we want to do inside this file manager. We want to save images to the file manager and then get images back from the file manager. So let's create our first func. We'll say save image. We'll open close the parentheses and then open the brackets. And when we go to save an image, obviously we need to pass in the image that we're going to save. So we'll say image of type UI image. And we don't have access to UI image because we have not yet import SwiftUI at the top here. Now we can pass in a UI image. All right, and in this function, the first thing we need to do is get the data for this image, because if you followed the SwiftUI continued learning playlist, you are aware that we can't actually save an image directly to the file manager. We can save the data for the image to the file manager. So let's say let data, and we'll set it equal to the image.png data. And I'm using PNG because I believe that the images we're downloading are actually PNG and not JPEG. If they were JPEG photos, we would do .jpeg data, but we're going to do PNG, and we can see that this returns us data and that it's optional. So let's just make sure that we get data here. So instead we'll say guard let data equals this, else, and if we can't get the data, we'll just return out of this function. All right, and now to save this data, all we need to do is call data.write. And we have this option here where we write to, and we see here that it throws, which means we have to try to do this, and there's a possibility that it throws an error. Let's click enter here. And of course we need a URL. We don't have a URL yet, but let's create a fake one for a second. So first we're going to say guard let data equals this. We'll say comma, and we'll say let URL, and we'll set it equal to URL, and we'll use the string here, and we'll just do a blank string for 1 second. We're going to update this in a second just to get a URL, and we'll pass this URL into our code here. Then we're going to get the error message that this call can throw, and it's not marked with try, so we can add try here. And then we're going to get the error message that the errors are thrown but not handled. And what it really wants us to do is put this into a do catch statement. So we'll say do catch, and we're going to put our try in the try, obviously. I'll delete this. And we're going to catch the errors, and we'll say let error. So if we catch this error, we'll just print it out here. So let's just say print error saving image. And then let's backslash open close parentheses, and we'll print out the error just so that we can see what the actual error was. Obviously, I don't think we're going to actually run into this. The last thing we need to do in this function is actually update the URL on where we want to save this image. And we're going to actually save the image inside a custom folder in the file manager. So I covered this also in the SwiftUI continued learning, so I'm going to move a little faster here. But let's first create a function to get the URL for the folder that we want to go into. So let's create a private func, and we're making it private because we're only going to access it within this class. Let's make it a func, and we'll say get URL for folder, and we'll pass in the name of the folder that we want to get. That will be of type string, and this will return us a URL, and we will open the brackets. Let's actually make it return an optional URL. All right, and we are going to access the file manager. So let's say let URL equals file manager. We'll say .default.urls for in, and we're going to use the catches directory because that's kind of like one of the least important. And we're using the catches directory because these images are obviously important to our app. But if the catches directory gets full and it starts unloading images, we're okay with that because we also have the ability and the logic to download these images again if we need it. So that's why we are comfortable using the catches directory. We're going to say in, and this will be the user domain mask. And then we just want to get the first URL in this directory. So we'll say .first. And if I hold the option button and click on the URL, we can see that it is actually optional. So let's unwrap it like good coders. We'll say guard let URL equals this, else we will open the brackets. And if we can't get this first URL, let's just return out of this function. And we need to return an optional URL. So since we don't have one, let's just return nil. I'll actually put this on another line just because it makes it look a little more readable. And if we can get this URL, let's then return the URL dot appending path component. And from this URL, we want to append our folder name. So of course, we're going to take this name and we're just going to append it right here. And this will return us the folder URL that we are looking for. Let's create one more function. So now we have the URL for the folder, but now we also need a URL where we actually want to save the image inside the folder. So let's create a private func, get URL for image. And when we save the image, it's also going to need a name. So we're going to call this image name, and it will be of type string. And this function will return us a URL, and we'll make it optional again in case we can't get it. And we'll open the brackets. All right, and to get the URL for the image, first we want to get the URL for the folder, and then we want to append the image name just like we did here, except this was the folder name. Now we're going to do the image name on top of that. So first we're going to say let folder URL equals, and we're going to call get URL for folder. And when we get the URL for the folder, we need to pass in the folder name to this function. Let's actually change this to folder name. So we'll say folder name. We'll pass that in here. And we'll change this as well. And we need to pass in the name of the folder where this image is going to be saved. We don't have that yet in this function, so after image name, let's also input the folder name of type string. We'll take the folder name, we'll pass it in here. And if I hold the option button and click on this folder URL, we can see that it is returning an optional URL. So here, let's just say guard let folder URL equals this, else, open the brackets. So if we can't get the folder URL, we will just return nil because we can't get the URL. But if we do get it, we will then return the folder URL dot appending path component. And the component this time is going to be the image name. So these two URLs are connected, obviously. We're going to go to the directory, and then we're going to do a backslash with the folder name, and then we're going to do another backslash with the image name, and that's where we're going to save this image. And when we save it, we need to explicitly give it a type as well. And since we're saving PNG data, we're going to save it as .png. So here we'll add image name plus, and we'll also add a string here we'll call .png. All right, so now we can get a URL for our image. So up in our save image function, when we have let URL equals URL, let's actually delete this and call get URL for image. And now we need to pass in a image name as well as a folder name. So let's make those parameters in our function. So save image will also pass in image name of type string and folder name of type string. We'll pass these in. And now we can get the URL for our image and we can try to save it there. And if you followed my other playlist, the SwiftUI continued learning playlist, when we covered the file manager, we also talked about when we are using these folders, we need to make sure that we actually create these folders before we save anything to them. So if we ran this code right now, it would not work because although we are getting the URL for this folder down here, this folder is actually not yet created. So before we even call this function, we should be creating the folder if it is not yet created. So let's create one more function here. We'll say private func create folder if needed, and we'll pass in the folder name of type string, and then we will open the brackets. So in this function, first let's try to get the folder path that we want to create. So we're going to call guard let URL equals get URL for folder. We'll pass in the folder name, and then we'll say else return. So if we can't get the URL, we'll just return out of this function, but we know we will be able to. Now that we have this URL, let's check if it exists. So here we can say if file manager dot default dot file exists at path. And here we can pass in the path of where we are checking this file. So that's going to be the URL dot path. And we'll open the brackets. And right now we're saying if the file does exist, we'll run this code, but we actually want to say if it doesn't exist. So we're going to add the exclamation point before this, and that will say if the file manager does not exist, we're going to run this code in here. And very simply, we're going to create a do catch statement, and we're going to try to create the folder. We're going to call file manager dot default dot create directory at. And we're going to create the directory at the URL, of course. With intermediate directories, we're going to say true, even though I don't think we actually have any here. And then for the attributes, we don't need any attributes, so we're just going to put this as nil. And if this try call fails, it will throw us an error. So we'll catch it here, and we'll say let error. And then we'll also just print out error creating directory. And then we'll backslash open close parentheses, and we'll pass in the error. Let's actually also pass in the folder name. So we'll say folder name, colon, and we'll backslash open close parentheses, pass in the folder name from this function. Just so if it does fail, we know exactly what folder we're failing to create. And for this saving image, let's also pass in the image name here. So we'll say image name, colon, backslash open close parentheses, image name. None of this should actually fail, but we are being safe coders here. So now if the folder does not exist, we're going to create the folder in this function. And we just want to call this create folder if needed before we save anything to the folder. So in our save image, before we even do anything, let's just call create folder if needed, and we'll pass in our folder name. This function is getting a little long. Let's just put some comments here. Create folder, then we'll say get path for image. And then down here, we will save image to path. All right, so now we have our function to save an image. And of course, we need one final function to actually get the image back after we save it. So underneath this save image, I'm going to create one more function. We'll say func. And this is going to be a public function, so it's not going to be private. It's just going to be func. And that's because we're going to call this from another file in our app, just like we call this save image from another file. I'm going to say func get image, and of course we need to pass in the image name of type string as well as the folder name of type string. We'll then open the brackets. All right, and in here the first thing we need to do is check that we can get the image URL. So we'll say guard let URL equals, let's call get URL for image. Let's pass in our image name, pass in our folder name. So if we can get this URL, let's also check that a file exists at this URL. So we'll add a comma here, and then we'll say file manager dot default dot file exists at path. And we're going to pass in the path here, which is the URL dot path. And then we'll say else. So if we can't get this URL or the file manager does not exist, let's return out of this function. So this function is going to actually return us a UI image. We're going to make it optional in case we can't get it. So if we fail this guard statement, we are going to return nil, return nothing. But if we are successful, we're going to return a UI image, open the parentheses, and we're going to use the contents of file initializer. And with this initializer, we can get a UI image from a file path directly. So in here, we can just pass in our url.path. All right, I know that was a lot of setup, but now we have our file manager all connected. And I just want to point out here that I made these utilities, especially this file manager, I made this generic so that if we want to use this file manager, we could do it with any type of image, with any name and any folders. So we can change out the folders if we need to. We didn't actually hard code any paths in this file that would be specific to the coin images. So we could reuse this file if we wanted to save some other images as well. And that's why we're passing these in instead of making them hard coded in our code. All right, so now that we have this file manager set up and we have the instance that we're going to use throughout our entire app, let's reference this instance from the rest of our app. So I'm going to jump back into the coin image service that we set up in the last video. And in this image service right now, we are downloading images from the URL and then sending them back into our app. So all we're going to do now is basically, before we call this function to download a coin, let's first check if we already have the coin saved in our file manager. So I'm going to first, let's get rid of this colon here, and let's actually change the name of this function to download coin image. And before we call this, let's actually call another function that will be a private func. We'll say get coin image, open close parentheses, and open the brackets. And in this get coin, we're going to first try to get it from the file manager. If we fail, we'll then go ahead and download it. Now we need a reference to the file manager, of course. So up here we'll say private let file manager. And we'll set it equal to our local file manager dot instance. This is that singleton instance that we just created a couple minutes ago. So now in this getCoinImage function, we'll first say file manager dot getImage. And remember, this getImage returns us an optional UI image. So we'll say if let image equals the result of this function. So if we can get this image, we will then open the brackets. And we need to pass in our image name as well as a folder name. And we're going to save the images based on the ID that the coins have. So the image name here is actually going to be our coin.id. And then we need a folder name for our coins. So let's just hard code this folder name into this specific service, because this file is specific for our coin images. So they're always going to be in the exact same folder. So up here, let's say private let folder name, and we'll set this equal to coin_images. The only thing to be sure here is that we don't use any spaces in this string. So let's take this folder name and we pass that in here. So we'll say if let image equals this. So we're getting the image from the file manager, and if it is successful, we'll then set it equal to this image up here. And let's just change this to saved image. So if it's successful, we'll set the image at the top of the view here, this one, equal to saved image. And let's also just print out here quickly, retrieved image from file manager. So when we do call this, so every time we see this print out to our database, we are saving ourselves from downloading that image in extra time. So that's a lot of extra data that we are going to save. Hopefully, if we do everything right, this should print out a whole bunch of times as we start scrolling around our app. Let's then say else. So if we don't have this saved image and we can't save it, then we're going to call download coin image. Let's take this print statement and just put it into this function here. So the first time we load our app, it should download all these images, but after we download them once, we then want to save those images to the file manager. So in the completion here, after we get our returned image from downloading it, we send it back into our app, we cancel the image subscription, and then let's also call here self dot we'll reference the file manager and we'll call .saveImage. And we're actually referencing this self a bunch of times. So in here, let's actually put a guard. Let's actually just make sure that we have this reference to self first. We'll say guard let self equals self, else return. So then these are no longer optional. We are sure that we still have that valid reference to self. And the image we're going to pass in is, of course, the returned image. The image name we want to make sure is our coin.id. So we could just add coin.id right here, but calling this twice, calling it once here as well as once here, could get a little messy. In case we called it wrong one of these two times, we would be saving and getting the images from different names. So instead, let's actually make a variable up here that's called private let image name, and we'll make it of type string. So when we initialize this coin image service, we will set up the image name explicitly. So in here, we'll just call self.imageName, and here we'll set it equal to coin.id. And then in our functions, let's actually reference the image name. Let's reference it down here as well. And of course, we're going to reference the folder name too. And it looks like the returned image is actually still optional. So let's also include that in our guard statement. We'll say guard let self equals self, comma, let downloaded image equals the returned image. Then we'll take this downloaded image, we'll set that here as well as here. Our error should go away, and actually all we need to do here is call self.imageName as well as self.folderName. Alright, so now we have this getCoinImage. Let's call that from our init here. When we call this, it's going to first check the file manager. If it can get it, we're going to get the image straight from the file manager. If not, we're going to then go ahead and download it. And after we do download it, we're going to save it to the file manager so that if we ever try to get this coin image again, it should already be saved. And then hopefully this will succeed and we can retrieve it from the file manager. All right, a lot of code. I hope you guys are still with me. I'm going to click run on the simulator and let's see what we get printing out here. The first time we load the app, we should get a bunch of these downloading image now. All right, so we downloaded all of these images, and if I scroll down, we're going to keep downloading all of these images. But now the cool thing here is if I scroll back up and I scroll past all of the images that we already downloaded, hopefully we don't have to download them again. Instead, we're just going to get them from our file manager. So I'm going to scroll back up now, and what do you know? All of these printouts are retrieving from the file manager. So you can see how this is going to be more efficient in the long run here, because if I'm scrolling around my app like I'm doing right now, we're actually getting these from the file manager. We are not downloading these again from the internet. So in the long run for this app, this is going to save us from downloading so much extra data, right? Because every single time I open this app, we're going to probably see the Bitcoin symbol. And we don't need to download that 100 times. Instead, we'll download it once and save it to the file manager. And we saved it in the caches directory so that if the file manager, if that folder ever gets too full, it will start emptying out automatically. And if it ever does get emptied and we do lose that file, we have the code in our app to just download it again if it ever doesn't exist. All right, guys, I'm just going to delete these print statements now that we know our file manager is working. And that is it for this video. So thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.